The delegate from Montgomery, Delegate Hurst.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, a few weeks ago, I was at a roundtable discussion in Abington, Virginia, on the very issue that brings us here today. Now, when I first arrived, a family from Russell County and I started talking about all things not related to guns. They were a family of coal miners, continuing to be upset about bad health care, jobs that have gone away, and how they just wish their children and their grandchildren didn't have to move away from home after school. And we talked about guns. And Mr. Speaker, the 5 men of that family nodded their heads in agreement with me that universal background checks and an extreme risk protective order law could be passed and should be passed into law and would not significantly infringe on their Second Amendment rights. Consensus, Mr. Speaker, compromise. It was there for us in Abington, Virginia. We can find the common ground we are seeking on this all-important issue of gun violence. But soon, Mr. Speaker, quickly the mood changed. The event began. Politics and partisan rhetoric was injected, and the discourse devolved into the same kind of shouting match we've seen on gun policy for decades. Then, during the middle of the noise, one man said to me, "And for you, I'm so sorry for your loss. We all watched it happen on TV, but maybe if you were there, or she," and I had to cut him off. "Don't," I said. And he apologized and moved on. Mr. Speaker, that what if has tormented me from the day I personally became impacted by gun violence. When Adam Ward and Allison Parker, my then girlfriend, were shot and killed, murdered, doing their job as journalists. What if I had been there? We hear these faux attempts at masculinity. Every time there's an act of violence where a vigilante thinks he could be that marksman shot in a crisis. But even though I reject that premise, I live to this day with that collateral damage, a feeling I betrayed the woman I loved. What kind of man am I, Mr. Speaker, that I wasn't there to protect her? That maybe I should have been there? What if somebody else had been there? How could I let this happen to her? And how could I have prevented those lives that have been left behind from being destroyed? But you see, Mr. Speaker, that duty doesn't fall on me then, 4 years ago. I was fast asleep from anchoring the news the night before. They were murdered barely after dawn. The duty, Mr. Speaker, falls on us here in this body to protect the citizens of this Commonwealth, to shift the responsibility from teachers, clergy, lovers, fathers, and mothers, and put it all back on them is not the social contract I signed up for, Mr. Speaker. You say unfettered regulation on firearms is the price we pay for living in a free society? Well, Mr. Speaker, I know of thousands of victims, families, and friends who would love to have a receipt for that purchase price. That's not a transaction I agreed to. Yet here we are now on this day after yet another mass shooting to try and act not to prevent only the suicides, murders, and accidental deaths themselves, but the collateral damage inflicted to the families, workplaces, and communities that suffer for years after the news cameras have moved on. I refuse to believe that the only way our society and this body can even attempt a discussion on rational gun policy to save lives and protect communities is after a public display of violence, a mass shooting, or a high body count. Instead of playing the what-if game and solely trying to correct wrongs that may have contributed to the murders in Virginia Beach, let's talk about the kind of everyday gun violence that happens here in the Commonwealth on a routine basis. Those who died in Virginia Beach were honored by our governor and leaders across the country and here today. And I remain grateful that the same was done by this body and governors prior for Adam and Allison. I truly am. But deaths from public acts of violence isn't just what brings us here. We're challenged to prevent the funerals of those who die on our streets and our cities every single day, that so many of our fellow legislators attend, but sometimes not the governors, not the press. We should seek to prevent the funerals of those who die from gun violence, from gun suicide. Those are largely older white men in rural areas. Now, Mr. Speaker, no governors, seldom legislators, and certainly no press ever show up to the funeral of a suicide from a gun. So if the public won't pay attention to the gun suicides, homicides, and accidental firearm deaths that happen every day, if we only pay attention after these acts are done in the name of infamy, then so be it. Many of us are here in this chamber ready to act. We're ready to vote, and we're ready to change the laws to save Virginian lives. Because, Mr. Speaker, recently it became apparent to me that sticking your fingers in your ears looks exactly the same as a gun pointed to somebody's head. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm so sorry, but it's time for us to start pulling our fingers out of our ears so that we can actually start getting guns out of the heads and faces of other Virginians across the Commonwealth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.